This terrifying discovery was made by a Reddit user who shared it in r. Let's Not Meet. The post has over 37,000 upvotes and is one of the most popular stories in the creepy subreddit. It all started when I was flying back home to Washington State from Arizona. I had an overnight layover in Phoenix, and since my hotel was near the airport, I figured it would be easy to just take an Uber there and back. The flight back to Washington was in the morning, so I didn't have to get to the airport too early. So I decided to go to the movies and then get some food before heading out. After the movie, I went to a nearby restaurant. It was a little after 9 p.m. at this point, and I sat down with about an hour and a half before I needed to leave for the airport. I ordered some wings and a beer, and then saw that they had TVs in the restaurant tuned into the local news. While I ate, I watched them talk about how the city had just entered a flash flood warning and how people should avoid driving unless necessary. I knew that if I waited any longer to go to the airport, I wouldn't make my flight. And it was only 30 minutes away, so I just decided to drive. When I got onto the highway, I turned on my hazard lights because the roads were really slick. Then I saw that the lanes had been reduced due to construction. And since it was raining hard at this point, I ended up having to slow down even more. That's when I saw the other car. There was a woman standing outside of her car next to the freeway with her hood up, drenched in the rain, frantically waving for help. I pulled over and rolled down my window and asked if she was okay. She said, "Please help me. My baby, she's still in the car." I could see a small car seat in the back of her busted-up old Ford Escort, and my heart immediately sank. "Is anyone hurt?" I yelled over the sound of the rain. "My daughter's in there, and I think she's dead," she screamed back. "Please call 911. I quickly did so and ran to the back of her car. When I opened the door, I saw a baby girl strapped into the car seat. Her face was pale and lifeless, and she wasn't breathing. I checked for a pulse and turned her head to the side. She was already gone. The police and paramedics arrived soon after, and they took over the situation. I felt terrible and scared. I don't have kids, and I couldn't imagine what it must feel like to lose one. The lady kept screaming and wailing, and kept asking why her baby was dead. The last thing I remember hearing her say was, she was supposed to be dead already. I should have done it last night. At that point, they took her into custody and brought her to a different car, and I drove off to the airport, shaken but satisfied that I at least tried to save the baby. After I dropped my bags off and went through security, I sat down and waited for boarding to begin. When I heard a commotion near the gate and turned to see that same woman from earlier running full speed towards us. Her hair was a wild mess, and her eyes were wide with panic. I don't think I've ever seen someone move so fast. She made it to the gate just in time, and as soon as the boarding began, she rushed to board the plane. I was still shook from finding the baby dead in the car, but I figured that maybe something had happened at home, and she was just really stressed, so I let it go. A few minutes after takeoff, I settled in and began watching a movie. That's when I felt something odd. I looked around and noticed that all of the passengers on the plane were wearing masks while they slept. I thought, I wonder if there's some sort of outbreak going on? Just then, the flight attendant came down the aisle offering drinks. When she reached me, I asked, "What's with all the masks? Is there something wrong?" She leaned in close and whispered, "You're gonna want to put one of these on, hon." She handed me a mask, and I hesitantly put it on. When I turned back to the TV, I noticed that the woman in the row behind me was now awake and staring directly at me. She took her mask off to reveal a ghastly white face with no nose or mouth. It was like a horrifying Halloween mask, except that it was very obviously real human skin. She smiled at me with what appeared to be a mouthful of sharp teeth. I immediately panicked and ripped my mask off and started screaming for help. Of course, everyone woke up and turned to stare at me. By now, the woman had taken her seat and put her mask back on. I was freaking out internally, thinking about how she had been staring at me the whole time and wondering if she'd been planning something. The flight attendant came over and, sensing my terror, quickly put a calming hand on my shoulder and told me to calm down and put my mask back on. "Please," I begged her, "don't make me." I was genuinely terrified of whatever this woman was, and I refused to go back in my seat until we landed. When I explained what had happened, the flight attendant looked at me sympathetically and promised to keep an eye on her. At this point, I was desperate and called the only person I could think of. I dialed 911 and explained the situation to the operator. Of course, he thought I was crazy. How could I have been talking to the woman on the phone? I explained about the baby and how she might be dangerous. He stayed on the line with me until we landed and promised that the authorities would meet us when we got off the plane. When we finally touched down and I stepped off the plane, I saw a swarm of police officers waiting for me. I explained what had happened again, and they searched the woman's luggage. They found a small hatchet, several knives, a rope, some handcuffs, a syringe filled with an unknown substance, and a bottle of pills. She was taken into custody, and I never saw her again. I hope that lady gets the help she needs. She sounds very troubled. But this story has a pretty dark tone overall. So let's lighten things up a bit with another terrifying airport story. This chilling tale comes from a Reddit user who says that their father used to work as a baggage handler at an airport. One day a flight landed, and the pilot went over the intercom to report that there was a passenger on board who hadn't made it off the plane yet. The man had apparently passed away in his seat. The crew was instructed to keep the doors open, and the baggage handlers were informed that the deceased man's luggage should not be collected. The workers were confused since it's standard procedure to unload every single piece of luggage from a plane when it lands. But they knew better than to question the pilot's orders, so they left the man's suitcase on the jetway. When the plane had been cleared and the jetway was detached, one of the baggage handlers noticed that the suitcase was still sitting there, along with a duffel bag that had clearly been packed in a rush. The tag on the suitcase showed that it was overweight, so two of the baggage handlers, one man and one woman, decided to wheel it to the lost and found together. On the way, they passed by the loading bridge, and the man asked the woman if she wanted to see something funny. He disconnected the emergency brake, which released the parking gear, and the suitcase began rolling down the ramp. They both started laughing, but then the woman stopped and said, "Oh my God, we're going to get fired." The man replied, "Yeah, but we can just blame it on the kid, right?" And then they both burst out laughing again. The woman then called out to a passing supervisor and explained the situation. The supervisor nodded and said, "No problem. It happens all the time." He then picked up the suitcase and headed into the building. But when he walked into the lost and found, he almost dropped the suitcase in shock. It was filled with thousands of dollars worth of brand new electronics, lots of jewelry, and a thick stack of cash. He immediately called the police, who tracked down the owner of the bag, a famous CEO. The CEO was shocked and grateful, but insisted that the employees keep the money in electronics as a reward for their honesty. To this day, none of the baggage handlers have ever moved the duffel bag. They're afraid that it might contain something dangerous or illegal. Would you ever find a duffel bag on a loading ramp? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear another scary airport story, stay tuned.